Genesis 2. So we've been sharing there the last couple of weeks together, and we've grown and learned quite a bit from it, and thought it would be helpful and valuable today for us to share there and determine what we can further expand on and grow from and have dialogue about in the class today. Obviously, that we can't do on Sunday, but can expand in our time of sharing as we study together. Obviously, as I shared already, there's a lot going on in the world today, in our country at least, with the election and quite a bit of activity from city to city and state to state. We remain prayerful about those outcomes for the best interests of our communities across this country. So let's turn here, and while we are here in Genesis 2, would love to, as always, to have a moment to share some thoughts about the book, its background, its author, if we have ideas about that, and just what it represents, the book of Genesis. Any general thoughts, anyone, on the book of Genesis? Okay, the beginning. Right.
Where all of his people are gathered together of many races. God created all of us.
Okay.
He created whatever elsewhere, the trees, the flowers, everything about us was not done by man. It is God's creation.
All right. Thank you, Sandy. Thank you. Other thoughts about it?
Well, Reverend Downing, this is Sandy. I was just wondering about that second verse on chapter 2. I read from, I just picked up the book version, and it says, on the seventh day, chapter 2, verse 2, on the seventh day, having finished his task, God rested off his work. And, we've been talking about the sabbatical and different things and characteristics of God. Did God actually, what kind of rest was he getting? It wasn't like what we would understand rest, but could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I look forward to talking about that as we get further into the passage. Thank you for that wonderful question.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Other thoughts about the background of Genesis, anyone? Okay. Well, as was shared, Genesis is the beginning. And as Deacon Sandy shared, it represents creation, that God's hand in creation, the beginning of all things for humankind. That is the beginning. That at the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We know that from chapter 1, and that this book of Genesis states that it is not only the beginning of the Bible as we know it, but it also represents, symbolizes, narrates the beginning of creation of humankind and the earth itself. And so this is a powerful book in that regard. As well, we know there are, varying views people have about Earth's creation and its beginning. Yet we believe that God created the heavens and the earth, and that this book narrates that creation. It's not our intention to argue with anybody else, but simply to affirm what we believe about creation. And as well, we also know that Genesis appears in the first collection of the Bible's books. Does anyone remember what that first group of books is called in the Bible, the first 5 books? Yeah, Pentateuch. That's right, the Pentateuch. That the first 5 books known as the Pentateuch because they are the first 5, and that word Penta means 5 in the Bible. So we got a little bit of background conversation there. So we appreciate hearing you, but so just FYI, you whomever that is, we can definitely hear you. So just want you to know. But yeah, Pentateuch. Genesis is contained therein, those first 5 books, and teaches us about the heavens and the earth being created. And the Pentateuch itself is made up of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and it's believed that those books were compiled in part by Moses. And so we are blessed to be able to retrace the beginnings through what Moses offers to us. Any thoughts about that, anybody, before I move forward? All right. Okay. Well, if someone would be so kind to read for us Genesis 2, beginning, just if you would read verse 1. Genesis 2, verse 1.
Thus the heaven and the earth and all the hosts of them were finished.
Okay. The heavens and earth were completed with everything. Some versions say that was in them. Other versions, that's what was read. And so what's happening here is the writer has offered us this conclusion from the first chapter. And remember, the first chapter speaks about all that was made, right? The night and the day, the waters and the land, the air and the seas, the vegetation and the plants, animals, beasts of the field, etc., etc. And when we arrive here at chapter 2, the writer sort of brings that to a close and simply says the heavens and the earth were completed with everything that was in them. And this is critically important for us in the sense that it lays out that God's plan of creation was ordered, right? That it so that as we read through Genesis 1, if you get the opportunity, please go back and do that. You can tell that there is an order of things, and that in essence, God does these things methodically, and not to suggest that there is some method better than another, or that method is absolutely a necessity in order for us to honor God per se, but that the creation was not done haphazardly, right? And that it says the heavens and earth were completed with everything that was in them. So it demonstrates that God intended for us to have what we needed, that creation would be all-encompassing, and that the needs we had to sustain ourselves and the earth would be present. But it says where everything that was in them was completed. Any thoughts about that first verse? We're in Genesis chapter 2. Any thoughts about that first verse before we move on? Okay, so the days, the oceans, the land, the animals, the plants of the field, etc., all those things have now been made, and now we see again God in verse 2, and this goes to this verse is, I think, the verse that Sister Sandy was asking about. It says, by the 7th day, I'll ask if someone would read that for us, chapter 2, verse 2, if you would. Genesis 2, verse 2.
By the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work.
All right, great. Thank you so much. And so, interesting note here, harkens back to what many of us learned or studied long, long ago in our journey, this idea of Sabbath, meaning rest. And in this, verse and this sort of context, that word well, all the words are there. I'm reading from this different version, but if you're reading from NIV, it reads one way, some read another. Jacob just read one version for us. The version I'm reading from says that on the seventh day, God finished the work he had been doing, and he ceased on the seventh day all the work he had been doing. The point is that that verb there, whether yours says ceased or rested, either way, in the Hebrew is translated Shabbat, to rest, to cease, or desist, right? So it's a literal and actual cessation of whatever one is doing. And this cessation from is godly, right? As we look throughout the entire Bible, we do find God and then Christ the Son in the form of God ceasing, stopping, resting. And I think to Sandy's point earlier about how we rest and how maybe God rested, obviously there's a physiological question there, right? Because God is divine and eternal and the creator God, not one of sort of physiological dimension. So his God's rest, and God being an eternal being, not necessarily defined by femininity or masculinity, but just a divine being. There's some background noise here. Let's just fix that. So that in either case, rest though is still rest, right? That, and obviously we wrestle with rest in our world today. But in this case, what clearly is being said that the divine, the creator, the eternal actually ceased from working, that nothing else happened on the seventh day. And I think, I know in fact, that what's this word Shabbat is intended to communicate to us as God's people is that really it's something that God deemed as holy, that rest, that caring for ourselves, that the ability to stop, to desist, to decease, to desist from working, rather, to cease from working, desist from working, to stop in order to be able to be better, to be thoughtful, to be closer, is a part of who we are, part of what God intends for all creation, that there is a ceasing, a desisting for all of us from time to time. And in this case, God does that on the seventh day. And which is why, in fact, how we get these words, right? Saturday actually comes from Sabbath, right? So these foundations are very clear. We just drifted from them. And so as we look back at that wonderful question Sandy raised, it's a helpful reminder for us that societally, whether we're thinking about Haggai, which we studied for a few weeks about rebuilding, and how the people there had to how if the people there maybe had rested from what they were or were not doing, they would have had time to maybe process what they were missing. And as we look at our own world today, but all through the Bible, how communities, right, particularly the people of Israel, who this passage is pointed toward, needed those periods to be able to rest, to cease, to desist from, in order to be renewed, recharged, and to be sure that we're following God's way. But I want to pause there to open up for questions or feedback, and then kind of move forward with that same really, really powerful question. Other thoughts, though, about verse 2?
Well, this is Sister Sandy again. With that's going to, thinking about it in Steve, because I was looking at that voice from a human standpoint, but from a godly standpoint, he does many things. I mean, he's God, but he just stopped working on that particular thing and went on to something else. That doesn't mean he wasn't doing anything at all. He just went on, he just ceased with the creation and went on to the next task. So that definitely makes it more clear to me.
Yeah, I don't know that it says he went on to another task, but I guess, Sandy, that's something we could read into it. I think if we look at the centuries of people who have read into that passage, I'm thinking obviously about the Jewish faith. Most of those people have read it to mean that we're to cease and desist, right? So I think it's challenging for us societally because we're always working. We're always sort of doing, always finding another task to do, or always receiving another task to do. Someone's always got another. Right, someone's always got another task for us, even if we're not looking for one. So yeah, it becomes challenging to hear that, even to hear it. I'm thinking of Jacob who said to me, "I don't know, Pastor, I'm a graduate student. I ain't got time to be doing a lot of resting." And it's true, It's just, so, and all of us can say that, whether we're caring for loved ones, whether we are fulfilling careers, whether we are homemakers, taking care of our homes, our children, our families, ourselves, whether we're just living in a world that is often full of changes and challenges. Rest doesn't always sound like a realistic proposition, particularly as it relates to the way this is shared, this ceasing and desisting, right? This idea, well, who can really cease and desist, like just stop? And so that's where I think we're able to, as believers, kind of pick up the fullness of the passage, right? That it's not just about, oh, I stopped from work, or, I put something down, or, oh, I'm going to take a break. But really, I think to capture all of it, you go to that third verse, and I think that helps us to really identify context for what the writer means. Someone, would you read verse 3 of Genesis 2?
Verse 3.
Yes.
And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. And sanctified it because that and God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it because that is in it he had rested
Okay.
from all his work.
Thank you.
God created and made.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Shirley. Thank you very much. So, yeah, I think that contextualizes it a little bit, that while we tend to center in on hours, right, tasks, we sort of tend to compartmentalize things, even in the way we view the world, right? This goes here, that goes there, this goes over here. This means this, that means that. In this context, what God is saying is this is bigger than all of that, right? That this may be even, that the idea of Sabbath may be beyond a measurement that's quantifiable. It may be beyond concept or concrete, tangible thing that is compartmentalized into some category. But what God's actually saying, what the writer is actually saying here is that God actually made this day holy, that made this day divine, sacred, so that in actuality, because it's made holy, then rest, particularly Sabbath rest, meaning the kind of rest to which we give our whole selves, really, is more significant than place or position or designation, but in fact, rest really has, according to Genesis 2, right, really has a sacred place in God's eyes, and really is critical for us as God's people in living in the world. So that Sabbath rest, like giving our whole selves over to being renewed, rejuvenated, recharged, reinvigorated by God's Spirit presence with us and in us and through us, really is critical to the rest of the equation of creation, if you will, working out well, right? So that as opposed to saying, okay, well, maybe 6 hours on Monday are important because, you know, that's the hours that I do this, or so. Maybe the 7 hours on Wednesday, that's my busiest day of the week, and I get this, and that done, so and so and so. And maybe this day God created this, and this day God created that. That day God made the day and the night. That day God made the earth and the sea. But I think what chapter 2, verse 3 is saying really is that this day is the day God considered actually holy. And these other days no less valuable. But this idea of Sabbath rest is one that is really to fulfill us, to sustain us, and to pour into us what's needed to fill the rest of the days. So that idea of, okay, maybe God stopped and went on to another task. I mean, who am I to say that? It's not written there, but maybe that's possible. But I think more that what folks who studied it across the centuries are saying is that actually this day is what makes the other days even possible. That without a Sabbath in our lives, without a space to give over our whole selves, kind of like what we all used to do with Sundays, you know, years and years ago. I mean, it's going back longer than some of us on the line have been alive, maybe, but a time when there was an actual Sabbath in our country, right? If you think about it, there was a day of the week. It reminds me of that really great film, Concussion, which is about concussions in the NFL. And at one point, the forensic scientist from Pittsburgh says to the other forensic scientist, he says, you know, you're taking on the NFL. Remember, they replaced God on Sundays. And it was a joke, but it was his way of saying, hey, Sunday used to be set aside, but now it's filled. And so the longer it's been filled, the longer we as people in the world forgotten what Sabbath really means. So much so that when we hear the idea, oh, what is that about? Well, there was a time when no one questioned the Sabbath, because on Sundays, nothing moved. People went to church and went home. You know, people just stopped. Yeah, there was no store to go to. There was no movie theater open. It was Sunday, and nobody questioned it. It was just a common. It was a societal norm. It was normative that on Sunday.
Set apart. Reverend, does that mean sanctified? Does that mean he set it apart?
It was set.
Other days.
It was set apart, Miss Walton. That's right. That God set it apart from other days, and not just the day, but the idea of Sabbath, the idea of giving our whole selves over to the cessation of work in order to actually rest, that God actually set that concept apart. That's right. And so I think, we just drifted so far from that it kind of is outside of our realm of understanding, you know. But I'm just past 50s, but I can still remember when on Sunday the grocery store was closed. You know, when you didn't drive you didn't drive a loud car. There was just stuff you didn't do, and I was just, we were just Baptists. I mean, not to mention, the Israelite faith, the Jewish faith. On Saturday is there a wealth of things that they take a break from in order to rest. And in our faith, and every faith has a Sabbath. Every faith has a Sabbath, a period that they are to give themselves over. But again, to the point mentioned, our societal perspective is such that the more we do, the better we are somehow. Or, the more we accomplish, the more valuable or valid, or the more stuff we get done, the more things we accrue or amass or collect somehow, but in the actuality, we're supposed to stop at some point, right? And recharge. We're supposed to stop, pause, and reflect. It's supposed to actually break and renew, but we've just gotten so far from that. I mean, that it almost sounds, it sounds archaic. You know, it sounds draconian. It sounds like from another planet, another century of time. But it actually is. And if you stop and think about it, folks, if we look historically at those whose contributions changed our world in so many ways, whether we talk about scientific advancement or we talk about, societal growth, improvement, if you will, it often comes from spaces and places where people are setting themselves apart. People are going to study. People are apart to rest. People are thinking through very intentionally, thoroughly, and contemplatively what it is that they are accomplishing and working on, but not necessarily racing to another thing, not necessarily crowding in with tasks, but literally trying to think through one thing well. And so as we look at, whether we talk about the light bulb like the one above me, we can talk about the computer, we can talk about, I had a great conversation with one of our leaders recently who reminded me that there's an African-American scientist from Colorado who created facial recognition technology. And he said, yeah, Pastor, he says, I know the guy who created that. And he said, some background noise. And he said, he spent years working on that one thing. And we all laughed at him, right? And he said, we knew there's no way that's going to work out, right? No way you're going to be able to pick up your phone and it recognize your face and somehow execute a task. So that's ridiculous, man. You're wasting your time. You're going to go broke. You spend all this effort and energy on one thing. That's ridiculous. And he said the guy would work, for so many months and stop. Work for so many months and stop. And then when he stopped, he would review his records, go back through his trials, his research, etc., and then move forward. And finally, this guy created facial recognition technology that now is used all over the world, from Colorado, from working on one thing. And so it reminded me the idea that we've just gotten so far from where we were that it seems unconceivable, right, to go back. But anyhow, I think that's what's being shared there.
Also, Pastor, this is Jennifer. Good afternoon. That we as a culture used to really observe the Sabbath, because I remember my mother not cooking on Sunday. She would cook the day before,
right,
so that everything would be ready, just for us to sit down and eat. Also, when we went to the Holy Land almost 20 years ago, when we arrived in Tel Aviv, the high-rises had shoes in the window all the way up.
Wow.
They took their shoes and put them in the window. When we got into the lobby of the hotel, we had to just beg them to turn the elevator on,
wow,
so that we could get to our floor. That we're the only ones that have sort of forgotten how important the Sabbath is. And if you think about it, how many times have we said we need to just be? And that's what I think the Sabbath is going to the Sabbath helps us observe, is just take an inventory of what's going on right now. Just be still. And my great-great-grandparents, when a storm would happen, that would be a very good time for them to observe the Sabbath, because they wanted everybody to be still and sit down and turn off the electric lights. I mean, they just
yeah,
about it. But that's important.
yeah. And I think even beyond, I think that's a great example and reminder, Jennifer. And even beyond, like, centuries ago, I remember just a handful of years ago going to biblical sites, to where the Apostle Paul taught and preached. I remember we were there in Europe, and same thing. We arrived at a certain time of the day, and the streets were empty. Stores were closed. There was nothing open. And we were in a huge, global city. And we were like, oh, hey, let's go get some lunch. Let's do this and that. And I said, oh, this is rest time. I said, what? looked at my colleagues. We were like, we talking about rest time. He said, oh, everything's closed. It's 3 o'clock. Everything will open up again at 6. We were like, what? That sounds crazy. And so naturally, you know, we said, well, he don't know what he's talking about. We walked 3 or 4 different stores, everything closed. So we finally realized, you know, hey, went to the hotel lobby, no one in the lobby. Just enough to check in, went to our rooms and laid down. And sure enough, we got up around 6:30, and the streets were filled with people. And so I think it's just a reminder, to your point, Jennifer, that we wrestle with rest, right? We're not very good at that. You know, we've made such a habit and created such a rhythm of work and of doing that, to your point, the idea of being, we tend to think, obviously doing and being do coexist. However, as we look through the entire Bible, we see so many places where people who are trying to hear God just exist on being, right? We can talk about Elijah, who stopped at the tree to pray. We could talk about Esther, who went with her handmaidens to fast and pray. We could talk about the Savior himself, who went away to mountains to pray. We could talk there's so many examples, right? Naaman, who had to go to the pool of Siloam and bathe. There's so many places and spaces where folks learn to just be. And we've drifted from it so far that when someone says, oh, what are you doing today? Oh, I'm just going to rest. What? Oh, you all right? You know, so this idea that we've gotten so far from where we were that it's difficult to conceptualize the idea of Sabbath, of ceasing, desisting, and even more than that, to the point you all just made, that actually, to the Sister Shirley's version, that this is a day, this is an activity God actually sanctified and said, we want to make this holy, we want to set it apart, to distinguish it from everything else we do or are about as human beings, that literally this day should be different than any other. And to the point Sandy earlier made, maybe we can't say because it doesn't read it here, but maybe God went on and did something else. I know, but it doesn't say that. But for us, surely it's saying that God intends that we rest, right? That we stop. And if you look at the Son of God, his human and divine, he stopped several times, right? He actually stopped and rested, stopped and slept, stayed by himself, went off to pray, went to the mount early before the sun rose, right? Sent the disciples across the lake before anybody else, before he went even. So this idea that Jesus separated himself from people at points in order to rest, that he stopped several points in his ministry. In fact, if you weave through the New Testament, what you ultimately find is that after just about every miracle the Savior performed, he actually, in one fashion or form or another, rested. There's a wonderful chart I'll have to share with you all next time we gather of that sequence, that rhythm of the Savior stopping and resting after his works. But yeah, Jennifer, I think for sure your reflection underscores what was a real cultural nuance in our society that we just got away from. You know, like you said, your mom preparing the Sunday meal on Saturday. That's real. Yeah, I remember those. Yeah, I remember those. Yeah, I remember going to family members' homes on Sunday afternoons and knowing that no one had cooked that day. Right, the pots were on the stove. And you walk in like, wow, this is like a, you know what I mean? It was like genuine coming together. Like that day was different than any other. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Other thoughts, anybody, about Genesis 2 verses 1, 2, or 3?
Well, Reverend Donning, that just made me think of when I was growing up on Sundays. We weren't even allowed to set up the ironing board. If you hadn't pressed something and you wanted it, it was too bad. You were not allowed to iron on Sundays.
Whoa. Right. Yeah. And I think therein lies, right, the kind of to what Sister Sandy shared earlier, this idea of, it's almost what her question helped me to raise a question. What does that mean for us today, right? So today, unfortunately, we live in a world where, like, for instance, the city of Denver and surrounding is one of the most expensive places to live in the United States, without question, right? By the numbers, Denver is one of the most expensive cities in the country. So that being the case, that means people got to work. And so unfortunately, sometimes their working happens on a Sunday. There are businesses that don't close on Sunday, right? So they can't necessarily, not everyone can say, some people can, but not everyone can say, I'm not working on Sunday. Some people can't say that just yet. Maybe they're working toward it, or, building time, or putting in their hours or efforts, or gaining seniority, or maybe appealing to a boss or a company to, hey, maybe we shouldn't be operating on Sunday. But point is, right now, that's not possible for everyone. So then maybe that means we find other ways to hold Sabbath, right? So maybe it doesn't happen for everybody on Sunday, but maybe there are other ways we can identify Sabbath, right? Maybe other days, other times in our weekly rhythm where we can actually rest, can actually put other things aside. Because, for instance, as a pastor, I really don't have a Sabbath on Sunday. Sunday is probably maybe the busiest day of my whole week. And so realistically, philosophically, yeah, Sunday is my Sabbath. But in actuality, not so much, right? Because Sunday, I'm probably up at 5:30 in the morning, like every other of my colleagues. And we're up probably at dawn, preparing mentally what we've developed all week long from experiences, from work and service and study, etc. And then that day, on Sunday, we're kind of in full motion. And so that means, like other professions, we've got to find another day of the week that we can observe a Sabbath. And I think for all of us, that may be true in one way or another. And definitely in our society, for parents, right, raising children, for teachers, for people who are in the business of caring for others, doctors, nurses, teachers, physicians, etc., and many other professions where those days may look different than some of ours. But I think the point is that we do find a way to the memory of what Shirley shares and Jennifer shares and others, that we find a way to identify some Sabbath rest, some actual set apart, put it down, and just dedicate whole self to rest. Yeah. Other thoughts, anybody?
Yeah, I'm oh, you want to go?
No, go ahead.
Okay. One thing thank you. One thing that sticks out to me about these few verses are just like the beauty of Sabbath. And I think coming off of Genesis 1, this beautiful and poetic description of this creation story, and then at the end of it, God rests. And I'm just thinking about how beautiful that must have been to just like pause in that moment before, this is even before the fall. So just to like have the beauty of rest. And like, I'm reminded of this quote. I grew up in a very musical household, like playing different instruments and whatnot. It reminds me of this quote that's usually attributed to Miles Davis of like, it's not the notes you play, it's the notes you don't play. And like that idea of the rest, there's beauty in that rest. And I think this is really coming to me in these few verses here.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. Yeah, I agree. And as we study, and maybe we'll take some time to do that before the year is over, and maybe next week what we can do is kind of look further into it. But absolutely, this idea of beauty in rest, and if even thinking about so God worked 6 days, and the seventh day God rested. It's almost like an exhale, like looking at the work of our hands, of whatever it is we do, and just being able to be gratified by what we've been able to accomplish, and then to actually let it go for a moment, to actually step away, if you will, from it, and to find, and to your point, to find beauty in that, right? That we certainly find fulfillment in accomplishing things, whether it's a garden, whether it's a car we're repairing, whether it's a do-it-yourself project in the house, or, you know, working with a child on their ABCs, you know, whatever it is, we find fulfillment in it. But then this idea that there's not just fulfillment in the word, but fulfillment in the rest, that there's beauty in the rest, beauty in the breather, the desisting, the ceasing, the stopping, and seeing fulfillment in other things, you know, being able to look around us and see the skies, the earth, and the trees, to find belonging in creation, right? To find belonging not just in our commitments, obligations, affiliations, etc., where we belong and do and contribute, but finding fulfillment just in God's creation. You know, being able to walk outside, look into the sky, and know I belong. You know, I'm a part of this universe, and I'm resting, yet I'm still belonging. And I think that point is really helpful for us, because we're in a world where we find so much of our connection and our belonging through our work, right? Our fulfillment through our work, through our study, through our connections with other people in places, whereas this is really pointing to find that same connection, but even more so, to your point, beauty, fulfillment, renewal, and to the point that Shirley made earlier, being sort of set apart in just creation, just being able to walk out into the woods, or look up to the mountains, or, you know, like going to Red Rocks and looking back over into Denver, and sort of just standing there and taking it in, and just seeing that as fulfilling, you know. So, yeah, thanks for sharing that. Other thoughts, anybody?
I have a I was just listening to the person who just spoke, and it made me realize that there is one day that is designated as the Sabbath, because I believe the Jewish people, their Sabbath is on Saturday, and ours is, you know, on Sunday. But the Sabbath is whatever day that we can stop and commune with God. I think God stopped to commune with himself, you know, made it so beautiful that he saw what wonderful things he had created. So I think that we have to find a time that we are just going to stop and commune with God, going out there in nature and seeing how wonderful the things that he has given to us at no charge, you know, and we don't have to worry about anybody taking it away from us because we don't make enough money or whatever. Just being able to commune with God on whenever it is. And I'm like, Pastor, Sunday is my busiest, so my Sabbath has, sometimes I have to push it back in the week, so it may be Friday, you know, that my Saturday is not, but I make sure that I have that time where I can just gather myself.
Yeah.
There's so much going on around me, you know, I just, you know, need that time to say, God, now what?
Yeah.
Where do I go from here?
Amen. Yeah, definitely feel that. That resonates. Thank you for sharing that. Other thoughts, anybody?
Reverend Downey, this is Shirley. That's why I just love Colorado. It just reminds me so much of what God has done. And to go up to the garden of God in the mountains, the things that he has created, you just stand and look in awe.
Yeah, I agree. I would agree. There are a lot of them to see. We may need, Shirley, to publish, we may need to schedule a few, you know, little day trips next year when the weather gets back to warmer climates, and maybe just take some day trips and do some of that, standing in awe.
Yes, indeed, I would love that.
Yeah, I like that idea. That's a great idea, that we could take some time to just go and stand in awe And I think the idea of doing that on a regular basis, right? No matter where you live. We have folks on the stream today who are not in Colorado, so no matter where you live, right? Whether you're on the East Coast, the West, the Midwest, the North, or South, that there are those to the point.
God's country.
Mm-hmm. To the point Jennifer made that we can be wherever and find spaces and places that have nothing to do with what we make for a living, what we own, what we don't, but just being able to be in creation and be in awe and stand with God. Yeah, that's beautiful. Love it. Other thoughts, somebody? Okay. Well, I think we're going to break there. It's a good place to pause today and return to this next Sunday. But for now, Genesis 2, 1 through 3, this powerful, really short but really powerful pericope of Scripture that talks about ceasing and resting, that God finished the work God had been doing, and God ceased on the seventh day all the work God had been doing. To the point Sandy made earlier, this idea of God ceasing from work, and maybe God turned to the universe, I'm not sure, but certainly ceased from all the work that God had been doing in creation, right? And then blessed that day, as Ms. Shirley's version pointed out, sanctified it, set it apart, made it different to distinguish it. Blessed that day, made it holy, because on that day God ceased all the work God had been doing in creation. And so really a lot to learn and to digest and to share and to talk about together in that short passage. So I will come back to Genesis 2 next week. And I have a wonderful resource that I found that I'd love to share with you all. But the book is called Sabbath by Abraham Heschel, who's a powerful professor and teacher, gone on now, but just great work about this concept of Sabbath that I'd love to share next week as we move forward in this second chapter of Genesis. But for now, we'll break here and share some prayer requests and praise reports. I want to thank you all on the stream who've joined us on Facebook Live. Hope you'll join us again next week at 12:30 as we close here today. Thank you so much. I'm sort of teaching remotely today, so I had a little background noise. Please forgive that. But we'll be back in a little more of a quieter and controlled environment next week. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all Sunday. You can find us at youtube.com, here also on Facebook Live at 10:45 a.m. Mountain Time. Have a great rest of your week.